The law and its administration play a critical role in the construction industry in Malaysia. The Malaysian construction industry is governed by a complex set of laws and regulations, which are enforced by various government agencies and professional bodies. The primary legislation governing the Malaysian construction industry is the Construction Industry Payment and Adjudication Act, (CIPA), 2012. The act was introduced to address issues related to delayed payments and disputes in the construction industry. It provides for a statutory adjudication process that allows parties to resolve payment disputes more quickly and cost-effectively. In addition to the CIPA, there are several other laws that govern the Malaysian construction industry, including the Contracts Act 1950, the Sale of Goods Act 1957, and the Civil Law Act 1956. These laws set out the legal framework for construction contracts and the rights and obligations of the parties involved. The administration of construction law in Malaysia is primarily carried out by government agencies and professional bodies. The Construction Industry Development Board, CIDB, is the primary regulatory body for the construction industry in Malaysia. It is responsible for promoting and regulating the industry and ensuring compliance with construction laws and regulations. The Malaysian Bar Council also plays a significant role in the administration of construction law. It provides legal services and representation to parties involved in construction disputes and promotes the development of the legal profession in the construction industry. Finally, the Royal Institution of Surveyors Malaysia, RISM, is a professional body that represents surveyors and other professionals in the construction industry. RISM provides training and certification for professionals in the industry and promotes ethical and professional standards. The law and its administration play a crucial role in the Malaysian construction industry. The complex set of laws and regulations governing the industry must be adhered to by all parties involved to ensure that projects are completed on time, within budget, and to the required standards. The history of construction-related laws in Malaysia can be traced back to the early colonial period when the country was under British rule. The British introduced various laws and regulations related to the construction industry to regulate the building of infrastructure and other structures. Some of the early laws and regulations related to construction include the Straits Settlements Building Ordinance 1898 and the Federated Malay States Building Bylaws 1904. In 1950, the Contracts Act was introduced to regulate contracts and agreements related to construction projects. This law set out the rights and obligations of the parties involved in construction contracts and provided a legal framework for resolving disputes. The Sale of Goods Act was introduced in 1957 to regulate the sale of goods, including building materials, equipment, and machinery used in construction projects. This law set out the legal framework for the supply and delivery of goods to construction projects. In 1967, the Town and Country Planning Act was introduced to regulate the development of land in Malaysia. This law set out the rules and regulations for land use, zoning, and planning permission for construction projects. The Construction Industry Payment and Adjudication Act, (CIPA), was introduced in 2012 to address issues related to delayed payments and disputes in the construction industry. This law provides for a statutory adjudication process that allows parties to resolve payment disputes more quickly and cost-effectively. In addition to these laws, various regulations and guidelines have been introduced over the years to regulate the construction industry in Malaysia. These include the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which sets out the rules and regulations for ensuring the safety of workers in the construction industry. The history of construction-related laws in Malaysia reflects the country's commitment to regulating the construction industry and ensuring that construction projects are completed safely, efficiently, and to the required standards. There are several basic legal concepts in Malaysian law that are relevant to the construction industry. These concepts include: contracts are the foundation of the construction industry. Malaysian contract law requires parties to enter into a legally binding agreement to establish the terms and conditions of their relationship. The Contracts Act 1950 governs all types of contracts in Malaysia, including those related to construction. Tort law provides a remedy for harm or injury suffered as a result of the wrongful actions of others. In the construction industry, tort law is often invoked in cases of negligence, where a party has failed to exercise reasonable care in the design, construction, or maintenance of a building or structure. Agency law governs the relationship between a principal and an agent. In the construction industry, an agent may be employed to manage the construction project on behalf of the principal. Agency law requires the agent to act in the best interests of the principal and to exercise reasonable care and skill in carrying out their duties. Property law governs the ownership and use of land and buildings. Malaysian property law sets out the rules and regulations for land ownership, transfer of ownership, and the use of land for construction purposes. Employment law governs the relationship between employers and employees. In the construction industry, employment law is relevant to the relationship between construction workers and their employers. The Employment Act 1955 governs employment relationships in Malaysia and sets out the rules and regulations related to working conditions, wages, and termination of employment. Dispute resolution. Dispute resolution is a critical aspect of the construction industry. Malaysian law provides several avenues for resolving disputes related to construction, including litigation, arbitration, and adjudication under the Construction Industry Payment and Adjudication Act 2012. These basic legal concepts provide a framework for regulating the construction industry in Malaysia and ensuring that construction projects are completed safely, efficiently, and to the required standards. The law related to Malaysian construction can be classified into several categories, including statutory laws refer to laws that are passed by the Malaysian Parliament and state legislative assemblies. These laws are binding on all parties and provide the legal framework for construction-related activities. Examples of statutory laws related to Malaysian construction include the Building and Common Property, Maintenance and Management Act 2007 and the Street, Drainage and Building Act 1974. Common law refers to laws that are based on judicial decisions made by courts of law. Common law principles are derived from the decisions made by judges in cases that have been heard in the past. In Malaysia, common law principles are applied in cases where there is no specific legislation that applies to a particular situation. Common law principles are particularly relevant to issues related to negligence and tort law in the construction industry. Contract law governs the legal relationships between parties involved in construction projects. Malaysian contract law is primarily based on the Contracts Act 1950, which sets out the rules and regulations related to the formation, performance, and termination of contracts. Property law governs the ownership and use of land and buildings. In the construction industry, property law is particularly relevant to issues related to land ownership, transfer of ownership, and the use of land for construction purposes. Employment law governs the relationship between employers and employees. In the construction industry, employment law is relevant to the relationship between construction workers and their employers. The Employment Act 1955 governs employment relationships in Malaysia and sets out the rules and regulations related to working conditions, wages, and termination of employment. International law refers to the rules and regulations that govern the relationships between countries. In the context of the construction industry, international law is particularly relevant to issues related to cross-border construction projects and the international trade of construction-related goods and services. The classification of the law related to Malaysian construction provides a framework for understanding the legal principles and rules that apply to construction-related activities in Malaysia. Understanding these categories of law is important for ensuring that construction projects are completed safely, efficiently, and to the required standards, while also complying with applicable legal requirements. The sources of law in Malaysia can be classified into two main categories: written law and unwritten law. Written law refers to laws that are written and enacted by the Malaysian Parliament, state legislative assemblies, and other competent authorities. The written law in Malaysia includes the Federal Constitution, statutes, or Acts of Parliament, subsidiary legislation, such as regulations, orders, and bylaws, and judicial decisions. The Federal Constitution is the supreme law of the land and sets out the fundamental rights of Malaysians, the structure of government, and the distribution of powers between the federal and state governments. Acts of Parliament are laws passed by the Malaysian Parliament, and they cover a wide range of areas, including criminal law, civil law, and commercial law. Subsidiary legislation, such as regulations and bylaws, are made under the authority of Acts of Parliament and have the force of law. Judicial decisions, or case law, are decisions made by judges in the course of hearing and deciding cases. These decisions become part of the common law of Malaysia and are binding on lower courts. Unwritten law refers to laws that are not written down in statutes or other legal documents but are based on customs, conventions, and judicial decisions. The unwritten law in Malaysia includes the common law, Islamic law, and customary law. The common law in Malaysia is based on the English common law system and is applicable to all Malaysians, except in areas where it has been modified or replaced by legislation. Islamic law, or Sharia law, is the law based on the principles of the Islamic religion and is applicable to Muslims in Malaysia. Customary law refers to the customs and practices of the various ethnic groups in Malaysia, including the Malays, Chinese, and Indians. Customary law is not recognized as a separate legal system in Malaysia but may be taken into account by courts in certain circumstances. The sources of law in Malaysia provide a framework for understanding the legal system in Malaysia and the sources of legal authority that are used to regulate the various aspects of life in Malaysia, including the construction industry. The court system in Malaysia is hierarchical and comprises two main categories of courts: superior courts and subordinate courts. Superior courts. The superior courts in Malaysia consist of the Federal Court, the Court of Appeal, and the High Court. These courts have the authority to hear and decide on cases of a more serious nature and those that involve higher amounts of money. The Federal Court is the highest court in Malaysia and has final jurisdiction over all civil and criminal cases. It hears appeals from the Court of Appeal and the High Court and also has the power to interpret the federal constitution. The Court of Appeal is the second highest court in Malaysia and hears appeals from the High Court. It also has the power to hear and decide on original criminal cases of a serious nature. The High Court is the court of first instance for civil and criminal cases of a more serious nature. It has jurisdiction over cases involving higher amounts of money and hears appeals from the subordinate courts. The subordinate courts in Malaysia consist of the Sessions Court, the Magistrates Court, and the Native Courts. These courts have the authority to hear and decide on less serious cases. The Sessions Court hears civil and criminal cases involving lower amounts of money and less serious offenses. It also hears appeals from the Magistrates Court. The Magistrates Court hears civil and criminal cases involving small amounts of money and minor offenses. The Native Courts have jurisdiction over cases that involve customary law and the traditional practices of the various ethnic groups in Malaysia, particularly in East Malaysia. The court system in Malaysia is designed to ensure that justice is served and that the rule of law is upheld. The system provides a framework for the resolution of disputes, including those related to the construction industry, and ensures that parties are treated fairly and justly. In the second chapter, a comprehensive coverage of the fundamental principles of contract law will be provided, encompassing topics such as the definition of a contract, sources of contract law, various forms of contracts, the essential elements of a contract, and a thorough exploration of the concept of discharge of contract, among other essential issues related to the subject matter. We invite you to stay tuned and subscribe to our channel for this invaluable and complimentary lesson.